Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. And here I see you again with lecture 3 of Modern Novel 2. What we are going to cover today, we are going to start our talk with an introduction of James Joyce, the very first writer, the very first author that we are going to cover for modern novel, that is 20th century novel. We will talk about his most famous product, his most famous writing, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, the novel that he has written. And that is the core text we'll be using as James Joyce writing. We will talk about the specifications of the writer and his writing, the contextual background of the novel, the plot overview, discussion about characters. We will also try to have some insights in the beginning of the story, what kind of expressions the writer puts forward in his writing. For example, we will discuss the sensory experiences we gain by reading this novel, the political context in which the novel is written. We will try to analyze the major characters, as well as we'll see what is the mythological touch that the novel has. Before that we talk about the novel, we need to talk about the author, because we understand that author's biography, author's lifestyle in the society that he has is brought up. It's all very important as far as understanding story is concerned. We can see that James Joyce has a period of starting from 1882 to 1941 that makes him one of the early 20th century writers. He was an Irish novelist, and he revolutionized the methods of depicting characters and developing a plot in modern fiction. Now, how the characterization was before James Joyce and what kind of changes occurred with the revolutionized methodology that James Joyce presented, it's very important to understand that, and what kind of new developments that he introduced in the modern fiction's plot. His astonishing way of constructing a novel, his frank portrayal of human nature in his book, and his complete command of English has made him one of the outstanding influences on literature. So 3 major qualities that you will find in James Joyce's work is his wonderful way and quite friendly and compatible way of portraying a human nature. Again, you will see a touch of stream of consciousness here, because that gives liberty to the writer to discuss one's character. His complete command of English, wonderfully play of language, and its outstanding influence on literature, the kind of allusion, the most appropriate and matchable allusions that you will find in his writing. So the novel also explores James Joyce's relation with Ireland, with the Irish conflict that was in process in that time. And we see that in the 20th century, Joyce was, although he was deeply influenced by Ireland and wrote all his works about Dubliners, but unlike his contemporary Yeats, he took no part in Irish nationalism or in Ireland's life. These are 2 different things that you need to understand. Although he was deeply influenced, but he has taken no practical part in Irish nationalism. The eldest of 10 children born in a Dublin suburb, his family was quite well off at first. But after the father's death, the Joyce family fell into worse and worse poverty. So this bit will give you an orientation of James' domestic front. And you find James that he was the eldest of 10 children. So you see the number of family members he has. And then, although he was very well off in the beginning, but after his father's death, they faced worse of poverty. So now, about religious and educational information of James Joyce. Like many Irish people, his parents were religious Catholic, and Joyce's education came under the influence of priests. So eventually what happens that he and his youngest brother were admitted without paying to another school run by a priest. He was a very good student, and the leaders hoped he would become a priest. So, right from the beginning, he was an outstanding student. But he left in disgrace because he lost all faith in the religion during his last year at school. So, you can understand that in the age of 14th or 15th, during this time period, he had a very strong faith in his religion. However, the circumstances and internal and external conflicts and confusions have made him leave his religion behind, and he got into confusions about his religion and faith. We understand his domestic front as quite a complicated and difficult situation. He was eldest of 10 of children. Then we find him that he did not have a very luxurious kind of financial status, and his even they gotten into quite a worse situation after Mr. Joyce died. And as far as his religion and education is concerned, initially he was taken as an outstanding student of religion, and he got his early education under the influence of the Catholic priest of his times. However, later on in the age of, when he was about to finish his high school, he totally lost his faith in religion, and his education was definitely influenced by that too. Now we see some information about his exile. Dublin College, and we are talking about 1899 to 1902, it's 3 to 4 years time, where he studied languages and literature. When Joyce graduated in 1902, he knew he would become a writer and an exile. Joyce believes the artist could only work outside the established social order. He went to France, Italy, and Switzerland for that matter. So it was a kind of self-imposed exile that stands according to his beliefs that an artist can only work outstanding and can only work only if he stays outside the establishment, so he can have a look not from the inside but also from the outside. So he had to set his own angle, and that made him impose on himself a self-imposed exile, and for that matter he moved to France, Italy, and Switzerland. Now, how do we find Joyce as a person? He took with him a peasant girl from the west of Ireland whom he loved very much. She was uneducated and had no interest in literature, but her liveliness and witty sense of humor delighted Joyce. They were devoted companions until he died. So we find Joyce having a wonderful companionship, and it's wonderful to the extent that he loved living his entire life with the peasant girl who had no interest in literature and also was uneducated. Her practical, sometimes cynical response to Joyce's work provided a needed complement to his own self-absorption. So although he was uneducated and had no interest in literature, his responses, her responses rather, I would say, spontaneous and impartial responses to Joyce's work worked as a complement for him. He promised her loyalty and a share in any happiness or fame that might come to him. No human being has ever stood so close to my soul as you stand. That's what he's saying to his wife. And that is why he promised his complete loyalty to his wife. Now, a word about the works that he has written. In his early years abroad, he began to write poems, short stories, and an autobiographical novel about Stephen Hero. But his book of short stories, entitled The Dubliners, was not published until 1914. And we understand that he completed his graduation in 1902, and his first complete book of short stories got into market, got published in 1914. So even after his graduation, he had taken 10 to 12 years time, a decade for that matter, to publish his work. His autobiographical novel was published in 1916 under the title of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and this is what we are going to study. So you can see the time period when it would have been written, possibly the first decade of the 20th century, the very beginning of 20th century, and it also came into being, it also got published in 1916. So this is going to give you a fantastic flavor of its own time, the beginnings of a writer, how does he start perceiving the society outside, and also its nature. Since it's autobiographical novel, you will find it quite interesting. Now, how he loved his country and how he is loved by his people. We discussed just now that although he was very much influenced by the situation around, but he was not practically involved into political campaigns. So most of his works were related with Ireland and especially Dublin, revealed the real world and especially the spiritual world of the people. So he was very much interested into political context. He was interested in religious changes and development happening in the society. Most of the stories and characters in his works, for that matter, come from his own experience as well as observation. He influenced many later writers like Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot. You would be able to recall one of the dramas that we studied in modern drama, probably in second semester, Waiting for Godot, and that was written by Samuel Beckett, an existentialist writer, a writer of realism, who bluntly portrays real picture of society. And knowing that Samuel Beckett's writings are influenced by James Joyce, it gives you an idea how realistic his work can be. So let us now discuss his works one by one, although very precisely. We will just be touching upon them because we have to move on to our core text by James Joyce. One of his famous works is Ulysses. This came out at first in Little Review in New York in 1918. Suppressed. The book appeared in Paris in 1922 in its complete form. So this got published and appeared after he had published his autobiographical novel that we are going to study. He became the center of a storm of literary controversy. Its publication was banned in the United States until 1933. So it was such a kind of controversial writing that his writing got banned in the United States until 1933. So it first appeared in 22, and for 10 years the writing remained banned. And writing not as a skill of writing, but this very written manuscript by the writer. So from 1922, when he first he first showcased his writing, Ulysses, until 1939, Joyce worked on Finnegan's Wake, and that he later published in 1939. And in between this time, he was not able to, showcase his work that we just talked about. However, in 1917, we see that Joyce contracted a disease that is known as glaucoma, and for the rest of his life, he would endure pain, periods of near blindness and many operations, and eventually Joyce died in Zurich in 1941 after an operation. So altogether his period lifespan is from 1882 to 1941. Now we need to understand modernism and James Joyce both together a bit in detail. And we see how both of them go side by side, or both of them go hand in hand. Modernism, the rise of modernist movement and what kind of role Joyce plays in it. Modernism rose out of skepticism and disillusionment of capitalism, which made writers and artists search for new ways to express their understanding of the world and the human nature. We previously discussed as well, and I tried to, in my previous lectures, I tried to reinforce your understanding of this new world. What is this new world about? Since it's post-war time and world has changed, people are skeptical, they are disillusioned. So writers think that since the world view is changed, since the world is practically changed, so there has to be a new form of art to express what they see into this world. The previous form of art that they would have been using by now is not enough to capture the real spirit, the real essence of what they are witnessing now in the world. So the French symbolism was the forerunner of modernism. The First World War quickened the rising of all kinds of literary trends of modernism, which toward the 1920s coveraged into a mighty torrent of modernist movement. So basically it was French symbolism that started this trend of new modernism and that in fact quickened after First World War. The major figures associated with the movement were Kafka, Picasso, Pound, Eliot, Joyce and Virginia Woolf. Modernism was somewhat curbed in the 1930s, but after World War II, varieties of modernism or postmodernism rose again with the spur of Sartre's existentialism. And the one reference that we recently had about the writer Samuel Beckett, you would know him as father of existentialism. However, they gradually disappeared or diverged into other kinds of literary trends in the 1960s. So what are the characteristics of modernism that you need to know so you can understand it? So now what we are taking together, we are taking modernism and postmodernism together. Modernism amounts to more than a chronological description, that is to say, the more recent does not necessarily mean more modern. Modernism takes the irrational philosophy and the idea of psychoanalysis as its theoretical base. We understand these writers, most of them belong to the school of thought, which we know today as a school of philosophy and psychology, and that is why their stance had a strong, their stances have strong roots into psychology and psychoanalysis, and that makes its theoretical base. The major themes of the modernist literature are the distorted, alienated and ill relationships between man and nature, man and society, man and man and himself. This is very interesting, since all four of these categories will let you understand that these categories emerged after human being got skeptical, they got disillusioned, and one of the major reasons for this disturbance and chaos was the world wars, World War I and World War II. And since this is the post-wars literature that is known as modernist literature, modernism, that is why all of these themes are linked as well as interlinked with this one major reason, that is disillusionment, destruction and skepticism in the world outside, in the society outside. You can see it is about distortion, it is about isolation, it is about alienness, it is about ill relationship, ill bonding, ill connection between man and nature, man and society, man and man and himself. So the chief characteristics of modernism are as follows. Modernism marks a strong and conscious break with the past by rejecting the moral, religious and cultural values of the past. Now you'll be able to connect the writer's biography, the writer's history, his personal history, with the kind of theories he's putting forward, and with the kind of theoretical atmosphere he's raising his consciousness, and he is showcasing his consciousness. Modernism marks a strong and conscious break with the past by rejecting the moral, religious and cultural values of the past, and that is what we are seeing soon after the writer is out and off from his senior school. He rejects the moral and religious values. So definitely he would build up onto that, and has become now a spokesman of modernism. Modernism emphasizes on the need to move away from the public to the private, from the objective to the subjective. So initially, in the previous writings before this era, you would see that writer was representing society. Writer was representing people's opinion. However, modern literature takes a writer away from society, away from public, and he's speaking more of himself than of society. And his talking and her talkings have become more subjective than objective. And writer is now going deep inside him or herself instead of going deep inside the society, because their angle has been changed. The new philosophy was that instead of going deep inside the society and trying to look at the product of society, that is a man or woman, and go deep inside his or her personality and see what society has made into him, into her, because that is the real society, that is the real self. Modernism upholds a new view of time by emphasizing the psychic time over the chronological one. It maintains that the past, the present, and the future are one and exist together at the same time in the consciousness of individual as a continuous flow rather than a series of separate movements or segments. That is the philosophy of stream of consciousness. Now, since we are moving from external to internal, we are moving from pre-modernism to modernism stage, where an individual is the focus of attention. So now we are going deep inside this individual, and getting deep inside this individual means exploring the individual's self psychologically and looking into the psychic aspect of one individual. And for that matter, stream of consciousness was the modern technique used for that purpose. Modernism is, in many respects, a reflection against realism. It rejects rationalism, which is the theoretical base of realism. It excludes from its major concern the external objective material world, which is the only creative source of realism. It casts away almost all the traditional elements in literature like story, plot, characters, chronological narrations, etc., which are essential to realism. As a result, the works created by the modernist writers can often be labeled as anti-novel, anti-poetry, or anti-drama, or maybe anti-realist. So after knowing the characteristics of modernism, the major attributes of this age, we now need to explore what is this major technique of the time, that is stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness is a phrase coined by W. James in his Principles of Psychology to describe the flow of thoughts of the human mind. Now it is widely used in a literary context to describe the narrative method whereby certain novelists describe the unspoken thoughts and feelings of their characters without resorting to objective description or conventional dialogue. Among English writers, James, Joyce, and Virginia Woolf are two major advocates of the technique. The ability to represent the flux of a character's thoughts, impressions, emotions, or reminiscences, often without logical sequence or syntax, marked a revolution in the form of novel. His first novel, James Joyce's first novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Although we are going to discuss this bit in quite in long length details. However, here this part of the presentation, this part of the lecture is where we are taking bits out of all of his works and discussing them to see what kind of writings James Joyce had given to his people. Now this novel is largely autobiographical. It describes the childhood, youth and early manhood of Stephen Daddles, a highly gifted young Irishman. After mental torment and inner conflict, Stephen abandons Catholicism and leaves Ireland, making up his mind to devote himself to artistic career in exile. Something sounds familiar. Now what is it? Maybe it is kind of autobiography we are doing for James Joyce? Well, that's a question. I will not serve that in which I no longer believe, whether it call itself my house. That's what he says. My fatherland or my church, and I will try to express myself in some mode of life or art as freely as I can and as wholly as I can, using for my defense the only arms I allow myself to use: silence, exile, and cunning. This is what James Joyce speaking for his own self-imposed exile. And why does he allow himself for that? The plot is symbolic of the relation between an artist and society, and as well as that between art and exile in the modern Western world. So if a question comes up, how do you justify, or how does James Joyce justify his self-imposed exile, and what importance it has, it adheres to the art and the art of writing? You can probably put this patch over there and discuss this in detail, that why do you think James Joyce did this? In the novel there are changes of vocabulary, idiom and prose structure to befit the various stages of the hero's development from childhood to early manhood, but the novel presents no difficulty as prose. It is the author's preliminary center over the field of infinite stylistic adaptability. That's very important. Now, what is this artistic point of view of James Joyce that one needs to know before getting into his writings? Joyce is a self-conscious and self-prepared artist. He holds that the subject matter of art should not be limited only to the sublime, as the previous writings would do. He totally contradicts this philosophy. Anything that pleases the aesthetic sensitivity can be the subject matter of art. So having that notion that only the sublime has to be the theme, or sublime has to be the character, or sublime has to be the major activity of writing, the modern literature, the modern writers, they contradict this philosophy. And they call it that any aesthetic sensitivity that basically pleases one's sense of aesthetics can be taken as subject matter of art. To Joyce, the creative artist should be concerned with the beautiful. As to how to apprehend the beautiful, Joyce quotes Aquinas' notion about the three required things for the perception of beauty. Now, since the writer of modern age focus a lot on beauty, because they think that anything that is beautiful can be subject matter of art, they have their own definition of beauty, and beauty is defined in quite a lot different and unique ways. However, what Joyce go for, he says that a beauty has to have these things in order to be called beauty: wholeness or integrity, harmony or proportion, and clarity or radiance. If anything, any phenomena in the world has three of these characteristics, that can be called beautiful. Joyce believes that literary art can be roughly divided into three forms: lyrical, epical, and dramatic. He also thinks that the artist is two in one. On one hand, he is an unconscious receptor. He receives, who reacts emotionally to the world around him. On the other hand, he is a conscious converter and schemes them in different forms. So an artist is doing both of these things simultaneously, and these attributes make an artist a true artist, who absorbs, who receives, and then converts and reports. In Joyce's opinion, the dramatic form is the highest form of art. To his understanding, the artist who wants to reach the highest stage and to gain the insights necessary for the creation of dramatic art must rise to the position of God and be completely objective. Now, his making an artist stand with God and then making God stand with this phenomenon of being completely objective is again questionable. To Joyce, comedy is the perfect manner in art that well explains why Joyce sticks to comedy in his writings, and why does he think that comedy is the best way to convey the message, and that you would see in the people who have been following James Joyce's writing, as again I would give you Samuel Beckett's example, Waiting for Godot. Basically, it's a comedy. It's farcical. You will see it's very entertaining. At the same time, it is loaded with messages. Even the silence is interpreted as a heavy message. And this comic spirit, which makes its early appearance in a portrait of the artist as a young man, achieves its great flowering in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. Now, we need to quickly review the works of James Joyce after knowing the characteristics and attributes of his writing and their relevance with modern literature. In the novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, this is considered as a novel of education. It tells a lot about his own life, but it is not a true autobiography. Although it tells a lot about the writer's life, it cannot be taken as his personal diary. It is not all true. It is fiction. It is a symbolic story concentrating the relation between any artist and society in the modern world. The hero of this book is Stephen, who resembles Joyce. Most of the time you will find Joyce in speaking in the figure of Stephen. It tells the hero's life from early childhood to manhood, which closely resembles Joyce's. When he grows up, Stephen realizes his destiny as an artist. He resists the temptation to become a priest and decides instead to be a writer. He wants to have the God-like power of recreating the world by the use of words and art. Why do we call it novel of education? It's usually about a sensitive young man who is at first shaped by excessively powerful and oppressive forces of his environment, but gradually realizes the pressure and rebels against it and tries to find his own identity. It tends to follow the pattern of rebellion either against parents or against religion. In this sense, James' portrait can be read as a straightforward, naturalistic account of the bitter youthful experiences and final artistic and spiritual liberation of the protagonist. Joyce's alter ego in the novel. Well, I have given you some references from the pages of the novel. His other work, Ulysses, which kept banned for until 1933. Today it is considered to be one of the great masterpieces of English literature. So it's a parallel with Greek mythology. Ulysses was originally the hero of the great epic poem. He is a brave warrior and and wanders through the world for many years after his triumphs in the Trojan War. Crossing seas and having extraordinary adventures, at last he returns his home just in time to save his wife from marrying again, as she believes he is dead. So, three persons in the novel. Bloom is Joyce, modern version of Ulysses, who is a middle-aged Irish Jew. A normal businessman. Stephen, a dedicated writer resembling Joyce. Molly Bloom, Bloom's unfaithful wife, representing the earthy forces of life and reproduction. So, you will see how all of these major events and major things in his writings somehow either resembling some autobiographical elements of the writer, or presenting the social and cultural important happenings of the time to let you understand what kind of realistic writer James Joyce was. When we talk about Ulysses, it is told entirely through stream of consciousness. The first part concentrates on Stephen in the morning. His thoughts show that he is an artist who stands aloof from society, the theme of isolation. Brilliant, observant and creative, his godlike abilities, but incomplete because he does not experience life to the full. So he needs to experience exile, taking himself away from society. The second part draws a sharp contrast between Stephen and Bloom, a complete man. The readers follow Bloom's daily activity through his thoughts, attending a funeral, truncating business, eating lunch, taking a walk, worrying about his wife. His thoughts reveal his whole history, past and present. In the evening, Bloom meets Stephen. Bloom has no son, so he feels very fatherly towards Stephen and follows him through various adventures in the night. In order to protect him, in the end, Bloom takes drunken Stephen to his house, giving him a meal and sending him home. Bloom goes to bed. The last part of the book deals the thoughts of his wife Molly. Joyce shows the disorganized, natural flow of her thoughts by putting no punctuation at all for 40 pages. So you can see a clear contradiction as well as the language play in the writer's writing. Now, another writing of James Joyce, Dubliners, mirrors the poverty-stricken years of early exile of Joyce's life. It is a look back in anger. Joyce portrays his countrymen as drunks, cheats, gossips and schemers, failures all, people who cannot take the chances life offer, and who, as in Arabic, prevent the young from taking theirs. Well, his summary, Judgment of Ireland, appears as a word on the very first page of the book. Paralysis. One theme running through Dubliners is that the best men are gone, that Ireland's golden age is past. They also represent the themes of frustrated ambition, social, political, artistic and romantic life of Ireland. In Ireland, only the dead are perfect because they are no more. The living are failure. That is the extreme of skepticism, disillusionment and pessimism that the writer shows in his writing. Okay, so far we were discussing different works that we can read from James Joyce. Now we are coming to the writing that we are going to explore, the journey that we are going to take along, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. And I will now, from now after, when I'm referring to the novel, I will say A Portrait by James Joyce. So when I say A Portrait by, I am taking basically the name of the novel, and that's quite long, so I will use the shorter form of this, A Portrait by James Joyce. we know the title, we know the author, we know it's what kind of genre, it's a novel, and it is an autobiographical novel. Now, who is the narrator of the story? The narrator is anonymous. You cannot figure out who is a narrator, and speaks with the same voice and tone that Stephen might. Well, now who is Stephen? I just told you Stephen as a character, and you can relate to it. What point of view is put forward? Although most of a portrait is in the third person, the point of view is Stephen's. As Stephen develops as a person, the language and perspective of the narration develop with him. We see everything in the manner in which he thinks and feels. So what we see is basically, we are seeing Stephen's feelings and perceptions. We are sensing them. At the very end of the novel, there is a brief section in which the story is told through Stephen's diary entries. This section is the first person. The tone is basically generally serious and introspective, especially during Stephen's several heartfelt epiphanies, and tenses for sure past. We understand that this novel is set in between 1982 to 1903 and is preliminary Dublin and the surroundings area that this drama is set in. Protagonist is Stephen Daedalus. Stephen struggles to decide whether he should be loyal to his family, his church, his nation, or his vocation as an artist. So it's basically a conflict between within himself that he's facing, although it has relevance with society, culture, religion, as well as politics. And you will find the rise in action keeping these characteristics, that Stephen's encounters with prostitutes, his emotional reaction to Father Arnold's hellfire sermons, his temporary devotion to religious life, his realization that he must confront the decision of whether to center his life around religion or art, is basically the point where you will see all kind of complexities are reaching its extreme. So what is the climax then? That Stephen's decision in chapter 4 to reject the religious life in favor of the life of an artist. So what happens when the drama is reaching its conclusion? That Stephen's enrollment in university college, where he gradually forms his aesthetic theory, Stephen's distancing of himself from his family, church, and nation. That means personal, social, and political life. So the major themes which are being developed: the development of individuals' consciousness, the pitfalls of religious extremism, the role of the artist, the need for Irish autonomy. And basic motives and symbols, since it's an allegorical novel, which are used for that matter: music, flight, prayers, secular songs, and Latin phrases, green and maroon colors, Emma, the girl on the beach. The foreshadowing of the novel can be taken as Stephen's heartfelt, emotional, and aesthetic experiences foreshadow his ultimate acceptance of the life of an artist. Additionally, Joyce often refers to Stephen's vague sense, even very early in his life, that a great destiny awaits him. So now starting with the novel in detail, and we will start with its contextual background to see how we can create some kind of relevance between the social and contextual backgrounds of the writing. James Joyce was born on February 2 of 1882 in the town of Rother near Dublin, Ireland. He was the oldest of 10 children, as I just shared with you, born to a well-meaning but financially inept father and a soulman. Pious mother. Joyce's parents managed to scrap together enough money to send their talented son to the college, a prestigious boarding school, and then to a college where Joyce excelled as an actor and writer. Later, he attended University College in Dublin, where he became increasingly committed to language and literature as a champion of modernism. In 1902, Joyce left the university and moved to Paris, but briefly returned to Ireland in 1903 upon the death of his mother. Shortly after his mother's death, Joyce began work on the story that would later become a portrait of the artist as a young man. So you may find some references of his love for his mother too. This novel was published in serial form in 1914 to 15. A portrait draws on many details from Joyce's early life. The novel's protagonist, Stephen, is in many ways Joyce's fictional double. Joyce had even published serious stories under the pseudonym Stephen Dedalus before writing the novel, and probably that would have given this idea of putting this down as a novel. Like Joyce himself, Stephen is the son of an impoverished father and a highly devout Catholic mother. Also, like Joyce, he attends Cloggenswood University College, struggling with questions of faith and nationality before leaving Ireland to make his own way as an artist. Many of the scenes in the novel are fictional, but some of its most powerful movements are autobiographical. Both the Christmas dinner scene and Stephen's first sexual experience with the Dublin prostitute closely resemble actual events in Joyce's life. So, in addition to drawing heavily on Joyce's personal life, a portrait also makes a number of references to the political and religious events of early 20th century in Ireland. When Joyce was growing up, Ireland had been under British rule since the 16th century, and tensions between Ireland and Britain had been especially high since the potato blight of 1845. In addition to political strife, there was considered a considerable religious tension. The majority of Irish, including the Joyces, were Catholics and strongly favored Irish independence. So the Protestant majority, on the other hand, mostly wished to remain united with Britain. Around the time Joyce was born, the Irish nationalist Charles Stewart Parnell was spearheading the movement for Irish independence. In 1890, however, Parnell's long-standing affair with a married woman was exposed, leading the Catholic Church to condemn him and causing many of his former followers to turn against him. Many Irish nationalists blamed Parnell's death, which occurred only a year later, on the Catholic Church. Indeed, we see these strong opinions about Parnell surface in a portrait during an emotional Christmas dinner argument among members of the Dedalus family. By 1900, the Irish people felt largely united in demanding freedom from British rule. In the novel, the young Stephen's friend at University College frequently confront him with political questions about his struggle between Ireland and England. So, after completing the novel in Zurich in 1915, Joyce returned to Paris, where he wrote two more major novels, Ulysses and Figure in Wake, over the course of the next several years. These three novels, along with a short story collection, form the core of his remarkable literary careers, and he dies in 1941. That was the contextual background in which the novel had been written. So, concluding with our contextual background today, if we look at Joyce standing in literature, in modern literature specifically, Joyce is celebrated as one of the great literary pioneers of the 20th century. He was one of the first writers to make extensive and convincingly great use of stream of consciousness, a stylistic form in which written prose seeks to represent the character's stream of inner thoughts, feeling, expressions, emotions, perceptions, rather than render these characters from an objective external perspective. This technique used in the portrait mostly during the opening sections and in chapter 5 sometimes makes for difficult reading, and it becomes very difficult to read and understand it, because you will see that most of the time there aren't any punctuations given. And maybe I have mentioned that for 40 pages you will not find a good collection of punctuation. With effort, however, the seemingly jumbled perceptions of stream of consciousness can crystallize into a coherent and sophisticated portrayal of a character's experience. So another stylistic technique for which Joyce is noted in the Epiphany, a moment in which a character makes a sudden profound realization, whether prompted by an external object or a voice from within, that creates a change in his or her perception of the world. Joyce uses epiphany most notably in Dubliners, but a portrait is full of these sudden moments of spiritual revelation as well as actualization. Most notable is a scene in which Stephen sees a young girl wading at the beach, which strikes him with the sudden realization that an appreciation for beauty can be truly good. This moment is a classical example of Joyce's belief that an epiphany can dramatically alter the human spirit in a matter of just a few seconds. So after having the contextual background of a portrait of the artist as a young man, now we need to understand the plot of the story, and I hope by now you would have started with this writing, reading it, and you'll be able to read and understand. If you are reading it along, listening to these talks, it'll be easy for you to comprehend, to question, and then find answers for your questions in these talks. So it'll be easy for you to completely comprehend the writing. So let us start with the plot overview of A Portrait. It basically tells the story of Stephen, a boy growing up in Ireland at the end of the 19th century, as he gradually decides to cast off all his social, familial, and religious constraints to live a life devoted to the art of writing. As a young boy, Stephen's Catholic faith and Irish nationality heavily influence him. He attends a strict religious boarding school called Wood College. At first, Stephen is lonely and homesick at the school, but as time passes, he finds his place among the other boys. He enjoys his visits home, even though family tensions run high after the death of the Irish political leader Charles Parnell. This sensitive subject becomes the topic of a furious political charged argument over the family's Christmas dinner. Stephen's father Simon is inept with money, and the family sinks deeper and deeper into debt. After a summer spent in the company of his uncle Charles, Stephen learns that the family cannot afford to send him back to college and that they will instead move to Dublin. Stephen starts attending a prestigious day school called Belvedere, where he grows to excel as a writer and as an actor in the student theatre. His first sexual experience with a young Dublin prostitute unleashes a storm of guilt and shame in Stephen as he tries to reconcile his physical desires with the stern Catholic morality of his surroundings. For a while, he ignores his religious upbringing, throwing himself with debauched abandon into a variety of sins. However, he continues to have these commit these sins. Then on a 3-day religious retreat, Stephen hears a trio of fiery sermons about sin, judgment and hell. Deeply shaken, the young man resolves to rededicate himself to a life of a Christian piety. Stephen begins attending Mass every day, becoming a model of Catholic piety, abstinence and self-denial. His religious devotion is so pronounced that the director of his school asked him to consider entering the priesthood. After briefly considering the offer, Stephen realizes that the austerity of the priestly life is utterly incompatible with his love for sensual beauty. That day, Stephen learns from his sister that the family will be moving, once again for financial reasons. Anxiously awaiting news about his acceptance to the university, Stephen goes for a walk on the beach, where he observes a young girl wading in the tide. He's struck by her beauty and realizes in a moment of epiphany that the love and desire of beauty should not be a source of shame. Stephen resolves to live his life to the fullest and vows not to be constrained by the boundaries of his family, his nation, and his religion. Stephen moves on to the university, where he develops a number of strong friendships, and this is the time where Stephen has reconciled with his wish and love for beauty and living for art and living in the world to the fullest. In the university, where he develops a number of strong friendships and is especially close with a young man named Cranley. In a series of conversations with his companions, Stephen works to formulate his theories about art. While he is dependent on his friends as listeners, he is also determined to create an independent existence, liberated from the expectations of friend and family. He becomes more and more determined to free himself from all limiting pressures and eventually decides to leave Ireland to escape them. Like his namesake, the mythical Daedalus, Stephen hopes to build himself wings on which he can fly and fly away above all obstacles and achieve a life as an artist. So this was about the plot overview of A Young Man. Now we are starting with a look at the list of the characters who are playing their role in the novel. So the very first character that we are discussing is Stephen Daedalus, who is portraying protagonist. He's the main character of the novel. Growing up, Stephen goes through long phases of hedonism and deep religiosity. He eventually adopts a philosophy of aestheticism, greatly valuing beauty and art. Stephen is essentially Joyce's alter ego, and many of the events of Stephen's life mirror events from Joyce's own youth. I'm just quickly going through all of these characters for now, and we'll be discussing the major characters in detail in the coming talk. The other character is Simon, who is playing Stephen's father, an impoverished former medical student with a strong sense of Irish patriotism. And sentimental about his past, Simon Daedalus frequently reminisces about his own youth. Mary, Stephen's mother and Simon Daedalus' wife. Mary is very religious and argues with her son about attending religious services. The Daedalus children, though his siblings do not play a major role in the story, Stephen has several brothers and sisters, including Myorky, Kathy, Maggie and Boody. Emma Clary, Stephen's beloved. Emma is the girl that Stephen sees at the beach, the young girl to whom he is fiercely attracted over the course of many years. Stephen contracts Emma as an ideal of femininity, even though he does not know her well. Mr. John Casey, Simon's friend, who attends the Christmas dinner at which young Stephen is allowed to sit with the adults for the first time. Like Simon, Mr. Casey is a staunch believer in Irish nationalism, and at the dinner he argues with Dante over the fate of Parnell. And Charles Parnell, an Irish political leader figure who is not an actual character in the novel, but whose death influences many of its characters. Parnell had powerfully led the Irish National Party until he was condemned for having an affair with a married woman. Dante, the extremely fervent and piously Catholic governess of the Daedalus children. Dante, whose real name is Mrs. Riordan, becomes involved in a long and unpleasant argument with Mr. Casey over the fate of Parnell during Christmas dinner. Uncle Charles, Stephen's lively great-uncle. Charles lives with Stephen's family during the summer. The young Stephen enjoys taking long walks with his uncle and listening to Charles and Simon discuss the history of both Ireland and the Daedalus family. Aileen Vance, a young girl who lives near Stephen when he is a very young boy. When Stephen tells Dante that he wants to marry Aileen, Dante is enraged because Aileen is a Protestant. Father Conmee, the rector at Wood College, where Stephen attends his early school as a young boy. Father Dolan, the cruel prefect of studies at Wood College, where Stephen had his early education. Wells, the bully at Clogwell's College. Wells taunts Stephen for kissing his mother before he goes to bed, and one day he pushes Stephen into a filthy cesspool, causing Stephen to catch a bad fever. Atty, a friendly boy whom Stephen meets in the infirmary at college. Atty likes Stephen Daedalus because they both have unusual names. Brother Michael, the kindly brother who tends to see Stephen and Atty in the college infirmary after Wells pushes Stephen into the cesspool. Fleming, one of Stephen's friends at college. Father Arnold, Stephen's stern Latin teacher at college. Later, when Stephen is at Belvedere College, Father Arnold delivers a series of lectures on death and hell that have a profound influence on Stephen. Mike Flynn, a friend of Simon Daedalus, who tries with little success though to train Stephen to be a runner during their summer at Black Rock. Aubrey Mills, a young boy with whom Stephen plays imaginary adventure games at Black Rock. Vincent, a rival of Stephen's at college during his graduation. And Boland and Nash, two schoolmates of Stephen's at Belvedere, who taunt and bully him. I'm just giving you a quick review of all the characters, so when you are reading you don't get confused having so many characters in the novel, since drama has few characters. However, novel can have a range of characters because they are complex in plots, and there are many plots going inside. Cranley, Stephen's best friend at the university, in whom he confides his thoughts and feelings, and in this sense Cranley represents a secular confessor for Stephen. Eventually, Cranley begins to encourage Stephen to conform to the wishes of his family and to try harder to fit in with his peers, advice that Stephen fiercely resents. And then Davin is another of Stephen's friend at the university. He comes from the Irish provinces and has a simple, solid nature. Stephen admires his talent for athletics but disagrees with his unquestioning Irish patriotism, which Davin encourages Stephen to adopt. Lynch, another of Stephen's friend at the university, a coarse and often unpleasantly dry young man. Lynch is poorer than Stephen. Stephen explains his theory of aesthetics to Lynch in chapter 5. That is pretty interesting. And now, last four tiny characters. McCann, a fiercely political student at the university who tries to convince Stephen to be more concerned with politics. Temple, a young man at the university who openly admires Stephen's keen independence and tries to copy his ideas and sentiments. Dean of Studies, a Jewist, a priest at University College. Johnny Cashman, a friend of Simon Dedalus. So this was the list of characters, all major and minor, that you are going to deal with in the story. However, we are going to have a detailed analysis of major characters in our coming talk. So this was all for today. Let us have a quick review what we covered today so far. We tried to understand James Joyce as a writer. We discussed some of his major attributes of his work, his writing style, his stylistic nature, and then we discussed different works done by the writer, and we tried to explain more in detail his writing, A Portrait of the Artist, as a young man that we are going to read as a core novel for this writer. We discussed the specification of the writer, the key facts of the novel. We also discussed the contextual background of the novel, and we had a detailed plot overview. We tried to understand what the story is and how it gets developed. What is the main conflict? What are the rising actions? What is going to be the climax, and where from the action falls and into what? We tried to understand different characters in the story, and for that matter we went through a list of characters, all major and minors, and we are planning to have insights in the beginning of the story by experiencing all the major characters in detail, and we'll be doing that. We will be experiencing the sensory expressions, political context, analysis of major characters, and mythological touch. I planned this for this lecture today, however the discussion went in detail and we could not manage to do so, so we will be covering this in lecture 4 along with the items that I've already mentioned here in the agenda. We will also be discussing themes, motives, and symbols. And here is a list of motives that I plan to cover in the next lecture. Again, it depends how much detail we go into the things. And for symbols, argument viewpoints, and we will have a detailed discussion on a few of the chapters. But again, that depends, otherwise things will have to move on to the next lectures. This was all about today's talk. I hope that by now you are following me and you have started reading your very first novel, A Portrait of the Young Man. I expect that next time when you see me in lecture 4, you are done with your reading, so you are better able to understand the characteristics of all the characters and chapters. This was all for today, and I say you goodbye over here, and we'll see you in the next lecture, inshallah. Allah Hafiz.